The morning sun beat down hard on the desert training ground as Captain Jake Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead. He had been stationed at Nellis Air Force Base for 6 months now, and the Nevada heat still caught him off guard. Jake was known among his squadron as the guy who could make anyone laugh, even during the most stressful missions. His quick wit and easy smile had earned him friends everywhere he went. Today was different, though. Word had spread through the base that they were getting a new pilot. Someone special, the commanding officers had said with mysterious grins. Jake didn't think much of it. New pilots came and went all the time. What made this one so special? He was hanging out near the flight line with his buddies when he first saw her. A woman in a perfectly pressed flight suit walked across the tarmac with confident strides. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and she carried her helmet under her arm like she owned the place. "Check out the new girl," his friend Tommy whispered, nudging Jake with his elbow. "Wonder what her call sign is." Jake squinted against the bright sun, trying to get a better look. She was tall, maybe 5'8", with the kind of posture that screamed military training. There was something about the way she moved that made him curious. Most new pilots looked nervous on their first day, constantly checking their surroundings and trying to figure out where they belonged. This woman looked like she had been walking these flight lines her entire life. "Probably something cute," Jake said with a grin, loud enough for several other pilots to hear. "You know how they give the lady pilots those sweet call signs? Probably Angel or Princesses or something like that." The guys around him chuckled. It was true that female pilots often ended up with call signs that played into stereotypes. Jake had seen it happen before. The military was slowly changing, but some old habits died hard. As the woman got closer, Jake noticed more details. She had sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Her flight suit fit perfectly, suggesting she had been flying for a while. This wasn't some fresh-faced academy graduate on her first assignment. There were small details that told a bigger story. The way her boots were perfectly shined, but showed signs of real use. How her flight suit had the kind of creases that came from hours in a cockpit, not a supply closet. "She looks pretty serious," Tommy observed. "Maybe she's one of those by-the-book types." Jake shrugged. "We'll find out soon enough. Hope she's got a sense of humor. This place gets boring without some good laughs." The woman continued walking toward the main building, probably heading to check in with the commanding officer. Jake watched her go, already thinking about how he might welcome her to the squadron. He prided himself on being friendly to newcomers. A good joke or funny story could help break the ice and make someone feel at home. "I bet you $10 her call sign is something flowery," Jake announced to the group. These Pentagon types always try to keep things politically correct with the female pilots. More laughter from his audience. Jake was on a roll now, enjoying the attention. $20 says it's rose or lily or maybe butterfly. Something that makes the generals feel good about diversity. What Jake didn't know was that the woman had exceptional hearing. Years of flying had trained her to pick up sounds that others might miss. She had caught every word of his little comedy routine. But her expression never changed. She just kept walking with that same confident stride. An hour later, Jake found himself in the squadron briefing room along with the rest of the pilots. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the room, looking unusually serious. Behind him was a projection screen showing what looked like mission statistics and awards. "Gentlemen and ladies," Colonel Hayes began, "I want to introduce you to our newest squadron member. This pilot comes to us with an exceptional record of service and some very impressive achievements." Jake leaned back in his chair, still thinking about his earlier jokes. He was curious to finally learn the mystery pilot's name and call sign. The anticipation was killing him, and he was already planning his next round of humor based on whatever cute nickname she had been given. "This pilot has flown over 200 combat missions," the colonel continued, "credited with 7 confirmed air-to-air victories, and has never lost a wingman. The kind of record that speaks for itself." Now Jake was paying attention. Those were serious numbers. 7 confirmed kills meant this person was no ordinary pilot. That kind of combat record put someone in a very exclusive club. He glanced around the room and noticed that some of the other pilots were sitting up straighter too. The woman from the tarmac stepped forward to stand beside Colonel Hayes. Up close, Jake could see that her green eyes held a confidence that came from real experience, not just training. There were small lines around her eyes that suggested she had spent long hours squinting into bright skies, searching for threats. "I'd like you all to meet Captain Sarah Chen," Colonel Hayes announced. Jake waited for the call sign. This was the moment of truth. He was still betting on something traditional and safe. Colonel Hayes paused for effect, looking around the room at all the faces staring back at him. The silence stretched out for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. "Her call sign," he said finally, "is Ghost Viper." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Ghost Viper. Those two words together carried weight that every pilot in the room immediately understood. This wasn't some cute nickname given to make people feel good. This was a call sign earned through action, probably deadly action. Jake felt his smile disappear. His face went rigid as the implications sank in. A call sign like Ghost Viper meant this woman was dangerous. Really dangerous. The kind of pilot who appeared out of nowhere and struck before the enemy knew what hit them. Viper suggested speed and lethality. Ghost meant she was hard to track, hard to target. Around the room, other pilots were having similar realizations. The casual chatter that had filled the briefing room moments before died completely. Everyone was now looking at Captain Chen with new respect and, if Jake was being honest, a little bit of fear. "Ghost Viper has been assigned to our squadron as part of a new training initiative," Colonel Hayes continued. "She'll be working with our pilots to share advanced combat techniques and help prepare us for upcoming deployments." Jake's mouth felt dry. He tried to process what this meant. This woman wasn't just another pilot. She was here to teach them how to fight, how to kill, and he had just spent the morning making jokes about her probably having a cute, harmless call sign. Captain Chen stepped forward to address the room. When she spoke, her voice was calm and professional, but there was an undertone of steel that made everyone listen carefully. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you," she said. "I hope we can learn from each other and become better pilots together." Her eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on each face. When her gaze met Jake's, he felt like she could see right through him. Did she know about his jokes earlier? Had she heard what he said about female pilots and their call signs? If she had heard, she gave no sign of it. Her expression remained neutral and professional. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that those green eyes were filing away information for later use. The briefing continued with administrative details about schedules and training rotations, but Jake barely heard any of it. His mind was spinning with questions and a growing sense of embarrassment. How could he have been so wrong about someone? How could he have made such assumptions? As the meeting ended and pilots began filing out of the room, Jake remained in his seat. He watched Captain Chen shake hands with Colonel Hayes and exchange a few quiet words. Everything about her radiated competence and professionalism. This was clearly someone who took her job very seriously. Tommy leaned over to Jake as they gathered their things. "Dude, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Ghost Viper," Jake muttered, still staring at the front of the room. "Yeah, wild call sign, right? I've never heard anything like it. Think she really has 7 kills?" Jake nodded slowly. "I think she probably has more than 7 kills. I think Ghost Viper is the kind of call sign you only get when you're really, really good at your job." As they walked out of the briefing room, Jake couldn't stop thinking about his morning jokes. They seemed incredibly stupid now. Worse than stupid, they seemed disrespectful to someone who had clearly earned her place through skill and courage. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jake went through his normal routine of equipment checks and paperwork, but his mind kept drifting back to that moment when Colonel Hayes had announced the call sign, the way the room had gone silent, the way his own assumptions had crumbled in an instant. That evening, Jake sat in his quarters staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring his first training session with Ghost Viper. He had no idea what to expect, but he had a feeling it was going to be unlike anything he had experienced before. Outside his window, he could hear the sound of jets taking off for night training missions. Somewhere out there, Captain Chen was probably preparing for her own flights. studying maps and weather reports with the same intensity she had shown during the briefing. Jake realized he had a lot to learn about judging people by first impressions. Ghost Viper had already taught him one important lesson without even trying. He wondered what other lessons were coming his way. Jake barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he kept thinking about Ghost Viper and what training with her would be like. He had heard stories about elite pilots who could make experienced aviators look like beginners. Was he about to become one of those cautionary tales? The next morning came too quickly. Jake arrived at the flight line early, hoping to get his equipment ready and maybe calm his nerves before the training session began. The desert air was still cool from the night, but he knew it would be blazing hot within a few hours. Other pilots were already gathered around the briefing area, their voices lower than usual. Everyone seemed to be feeling the same tension Jake was experiencing. Ghost Viper had that effect on people, apparently. Her reputation preceded her, even though none of them knew exactly what that reputation included. "Anyone know what kind of training we're doing today?" asked Lieutenant Rodriguez, a pilot who had been with the squadron for 2 years. "Air-to-air combat scenarios," replied Tommy, consulting his schedule. "Says here, we'll be doing mock dogfights and evasive maneuvers." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Dogfighting was his weakest skill. He was good at bombing runs and formation flying, but when it came to one-on-one aerial combat, he often found himself outmaneuvered by more experienced pilots. Now he was going to be facing someone with 7 confirmed kills. Captain Chen arrived precisely on time, carrying her helmet and a thick folder of what looked like mission plans. She wore the same confident expression as the day before, but Jake noticed she moved with even more purpose this morning. This was clearly someone who took training seriously. "Good morning," she said to the assembled pilots. Her voice carried clearly across the group without her having to raise it. "Today, we're going to work on advanced combat maneuvering. I'll be flying against each of you individually to assess your current skill levels and identify areas for improvement." Jake exchanged glances with Tommy. Individual assessments meant everyone would get personal attention from Ghost Viper. That could be good or very, very bad, depending on how well they performed. "Before we get in the air," Captain Chen continued, "I want to talk about mindset. Many pilots approach combat training like it's a game or a competition. That kind of thinking will get you killed in real combat." She opened her folder and pulled out several photographs. Even from a distance, Jake could see they showed aircraft wreckage and damage from real battles. "These are pictures from my last deployment," she said, holding up the photos. "Every piece of twisted metal you see here represents a pilot who thought they were ready for combat. Some of them made it home. Some didn't. The difference between those outcomes often comes down to split-second decisions and muscle memory developed through proper training." The group fell completely silent. This wasn't the usual pep talk they got from training officers. Ghost Viper was talking about life and death in very real terms. "When we get up there today," she continued, "I want you to forget about impressing me or your fellow pilots. Focus on staying alive. Focus on learning something that might save your life someday." Jake felt a chill run down his spine despite the warming morning air. This woman had seen real combat. She had probably watched friends die. Suddenly, his earlier jokes seemed not just stupid but incredibly inappropriate. The first pilot called up for individual training was Rodriguez. Jake watched from the ground as 2 F-16 seconds took off and began climbing into the clear desert sky. Within minutes, they were just tiny specks dancing against the blue backdrop. "Think Rodriguez has a chance?" Tommy whispered. Jake shrugged, but he was thinking the same thing. Rodriguez was a solid pilot with good instincts. If anyone could give Ghost Viper a challenge, it would be him. 20 minutes later, the 2 aircraft returned to base. Rodriguez climbed out of his cockpit, looking like he had been through a washing machine. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, and he had the expression of someone who had just learned a very difficult lesson. "How did it go?" Jake asked as Rodriguez walked past. Rodriguez just shook his head. "She's not human," he muttered. "I never even got a lock on her. Not once." One by one, the other pilots took their turns. Each came back looking more humbled than the last. Jake watched their faces and tried to read what had happened up there. Whatever Ghost Viper was doing to them, It was clearly effective. Finally, his name was called. "Morrison, you're up," Captain Chen announced. Jake's legs felt unsteady as he walked to his aircraft. His crew chief helped him with the final equipment checks, but Jake barely heard the man's words. His mind was racing with everything he had learned about Ghost Viper in the past 24 hours. The takeoff went smoothly, and soon, Jake found himself flying in formation with Ghost Viper at 20,000 feet above the Nevada desert. The landscape below looked like a moonscape of brown and tan colors stretching to the horizon. "All right, Morrison," Ghost Viper's voice came through the radio, calm and professional. "We're going to start with some basic maneuvering. When I give the signal, brake left and try to get behind me." Jake acknowledged the instruction and waited. His palms were sweating inside his gloves, and he tried to remember everything he had learned about combat flying during his training. "Execute," Ghost Viper commanded. Jake yanked his stick left and dove, trying to use gravity to help him turn faster. This was a standard maneuver that had worked well during training exercises. He expected to see Ghost Viper's aircraft turning to follow him, setting up what would become a circular chase as each pilot tried to get behind the other. Instead, Ghost Viper seemed to disappear. Jake looked left, right, above, below. Nothing. Where had she gone? Ghost Viper, I've lost visual contact," he radioed, trying to keep the confusion out of his voice. "That's the point," her voice came back, but now it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "Where do you think I am?" Jake continued scanning the sky frantically. This was impossible. Aircraft couldn't just vanish. She had to be somewhere. "Check your 6 o'clock, Ghost Viper suggested helpfully. Jake looked over his shoulder and felt his blood turn to ice. There, sitting perfectly in his blind spot, was Ghost Viper's F-16. She had somehow maneuvered behind him without him seeing or hearing anything. In a real combat situation, he would already be dead. "How did you do that?" Jake asked, genuinely amazed. "Experience," Ghost Viper replied. "And understanding that the sky is three-dimensional. Most pilots think in terms of left, right, and level. I think in terms of up, down, and everywhere in between." For the next 40 minutes, Ghost Viper put Jake through a series of exercises that challenged everything he thought he knew about flying. She showed him maneuvers he had never seen before, ways of using his aircraft's capabilities that weren't covered in any manual. But more than the technical skills, she was teaching him to think differently, to anticipate what an opponent might do and be ready with a countermove, to use the sun, clouds, and even the curvature of the earth to his advantage. "Your problem," she told him during one exercise, "is that you're flying like you're still in training. You're following rules and procedures instead of adapting to the situation." Jake tried to absorb her feedback while also keeping track of her position. It was like trying to solve a puzzle while riding a roller coaster. "In real combat," Ghost Viper continued, "the enemy doesn't follow your training manual. They'll try things that seem impossible or suicidal. You need to be ready for anything." Where? By the time they returned to base, Jake felt like he had been through the most intense learning experience of his flying career. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, and his hands were cramped from gripping the controls so tightly. As he climbed out of his cockpit, Jake saw Ghost Viper walking toward him. Her demeanor had changed slightly. She still looked professional, but there was something almost approachable in her expression. "Good work up there, Morrison," she said. "You made some solid adjustments during the training." Jake felt a wave of relief and pride. Getting approval from Ghost Viper felt like earning a medal. "Thank you, Captain," he replied. "I learned more in the last hour than I did in months of regular training." Ghost Viper nodded. "That's the idea. We're going to do this again tomorrow, but I want you to spend tonight thinking about what happened up there. Review the exercises in your mind and try to understand why certain maneuvers worked while others didn't." As she turned to walk away, Jake found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "Captain Chen?" She turned back, raising an eyebrow. "I owe you an apology," Jake said, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "Yesterday morning, before I knew who you were, I made some comments that were inappropriate and disrespectful. I want you to know that I'm sorry." Ghost Viper studied his face for a moment, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing right through him again. "What kind of comments?" she asked quietly. Jake swallowed hard. There was no backing out now. "I made jokes about female pilots and their call signs. I suggested yours would be something cute or harmless." For several seconds, Ghost Viper said nothing. Jake began to wonder if he had just made a terrible mistake by bringing this up. Then, to his surprise, she smiled slightly. "I heard every word," she said. "I was curious to see if you would have the courage to address it directly." "I heard every word." Jake felt his face burning with embarrassment, but also relief that she wasn't angry. "Those kinds of assumptions are common," Ghost Viper continued. "But they're also dangerous. In combat, underestimating someone because of their gender, age, or appearance can be the last mistake you ever make." She paused, looking out at the flight line where other pilots were preparing their aircraft for afternoon training. "The enemy doesn't care if you think I look too young or too female to be dangerous," she said. "They care about results, and results are what earn call signs like Ghost Viper." Jake nodded, understanding the lesson she was teaching him. "Tomorrow we'll work on advanced defensive maneuvers," Ghost Viper said, returning to her professional tone. "Be ready for a challenge." As she walked away, Jake stood by his aircraft, thinking about everything that had happened. In less than 2 days, this woman had completely changed his perspective on combat flying and on making assumptions about people. He had a feeling that tomorrow's lesson would be even more intense than today's. 3 weeks had passed since Ghost Viper's arrival at Nellis, and the entire squadron had transformed. Jake barely recognized himself or his fellow pilots. The casual attitude that had characterized their training before was gone, replaced by a focused intensity that Ghost Viper had instilled in all of them. Every morning, Jake arrived at the flight line earlier than before, spending extra time reviewing flight plans and studying combat maneuvers. The other pilots were doing the same. Ghost Viper's influence was spreading throughout the squadron like ripples in a pond. But today felt different. Colonel Hayes had called an emergency briefing, and there were rumors flying around the base about a real-world situation developing somewhere overseas. Jake had learned to pay attention to these rumors. In his experience, they often turned out to be true. The briefing room was packed when Jake arrived. Not only were all the squadron pilots present, but there were also officers he didn't recognize. People who looked like they had flown in from Washington overnight. Their presence made the atmosphere feel electric with tension. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the room looking more serious than Jake had ever seen him. Behind him, the projection screen showed a map of the Middle East, with several areas marked in red. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Hayes began, "we have a situation developing in the Persian Gulf. 3 hours ago, enemy forces shot down one of our reconnaissance aircraft. The pilot ejected safely and is currently evading capture, but his position is behind enemy lines." Jake felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't training. This was real. "We've been tasked with providing air support for a rescue operation," the colonel continued. "The mission will require precision, flying in hostile airspace with significant surface-to-air missile threats." One of the Washington officers stepped forward. Jake could see from his uniform that he was a general, though he didn't recognize which specific rank. "This is not a training exercise," the general said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Lives are at stake. Both the downed pilot and anyone we send in after him. We need our best people on this mission." Jake's mind immediately went to Ghost Viper. If they needed their best people, she would certainly be selected for the mission. The thought both excited and terrified him. "Captain Chen," Colonel Hayes called out. Ghost Viper stood up from her seat in the front row. "Yes, sir. You'll be leading the air support element. Select 3 pilots to accompany you." Jake held his breath. This was the moment that would define everything. Who would Ghost Viper choose for what could be the most dangerous mission any of them had ever flown? Ghost Viper looked around the room, her green eyes scanning the faces of every pilot present. Jake felt that familiar sensation of being examined and evaluated. When her gaze met his, he tried to project confidence and readiness. "I'll take Morrison, Rodriguez, and Thompson," she announced. Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. Ghost Viper had chosen him for a real combat mission. After all his mistakes and assumptions, she apparently believed he was capable of handling himself in actual combat. The briefing continued with detailed mission parameters and intelligence reports. They would be flying into heavily defended airspace to provide cover for rescue helicopters. Enemy fighter aircraft were likely, and surface-to-air missiles were guaranteed. As the pilots filed out of the briefing room to prepare for departure, Ghost Viper approached Jake. "Nervous?" she asked. Jake considered lying, then decided honesty was better. "Terrified," he admitted. Ghost Viper nodded approvingly. "Good. Fear keeps you alert. The pilots who aren't scared are the ones who make fatal mistakes." She paused, studying his face with that penetrating gaze he had come to know well. "3 weeks ago, you made jokes about female pilots having cute call signs," she said quietly. "Today, you're about to fly into combat with one of those female pilots leading your formation. How does that feel?" Jake thought about the question seriously. How did it feel? "It feels like the safest place I could be," he said finally. "If I'm going to fly into danger, I want Ghost Viper leading the mission." For the first time since he had known her, Ghost Viper's professional mask slipped slightly. She smiled, and Jake could see genuine warmth in her expression. "That's exactly the right answer," she said. 2 hours later, Jake found himself strapped into his F-16, taxiing toward the runway for takeoff. The Nevada desert was giving way to late afternoon shadows, and they would be flying into darkness before reaching their destination. The pre-flight checks had gone smoothly, but Jake could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. This wasn't practice. If he made a mistake, people could die. "Ghost Viper flight, this is Control Tower," the radio crackled. "You are cleared for takeoff." One by one, the 4 aircraft roared down the runway and into the sky. As they climbed toward their cruising altitude, Jake looked around at the other planes in formation. Rodriguez and Thompson were maintaining perfect position, their aircraft steady against the darkening sky. Leading them all was Ghost Viper, flying with the same calm precision she had shown during training. Somehow, her presence made the mission feel possible, even routine. The flight to the combat zone took 4 hours. They refueled once from an aerial tanker over the Atlantic, a delicate maneuver that Jake executed without thinking. All those hours of training were paying off. As they approached the Persian Gulf, the radio chatter increased. Air traffic controllers were coordinating multiple aircraft, rescue helicopters were reporting their positions, and intelligence officers were providing real-time updates on enemy movements. "Ghost Viper flight, this is command," a voice came over the radio. "Enemy fighters have been detected approaching the rescue zone. You are cleared to engage." Jake felt his mouth go dry. This was it. Real combat. "Copy that, command," Ghost Viper replied, her voice as calm as if she were ordering coffee. "Ghost Viper flight. Arm weapons, and prepare for engagement." Jake flipped the switches to activate his missile systems. His training took over, and he found himself following procedures he had practiced hundreds of times. The familiarity of the routine helped calm his nerves. "Contacts bearing 270. Angels 20. Ghost Viper announced. 2 aircraft. Closing fast." Jake looked in the direction she had indicated and saw 2 tiny dots against the horizon. Enemy fighters, probably looking for the same downed pilot they were trying to rescue. "Morrison, take Thompson and swing wide to the south," Ghost Viper commanded. "Rodriguez, you're with me. We'll engage from the north." Jake acknowledged the order and pulled his aircraft into a banking turn, Thompson following close behind. This was the kind of tactical thinking Ghost Viper had been teaching them: divide and conquer. Attack from multiple angles. The next few minutes passed in a blur of high-speed maneuvering and radio chatter. Jake found himself using every technique Ghost Viper had taught him, thinking 3-dimensionally and anticipating his opponent's moves. When the first enemy aircraft appeared in his targeting display, Jake felt a strange calm settle over him. All the training, all the lessons about mindset and preparation, suddenly made perfect sense. "Missile lock achieved," he reported, his finger moving to the trigger. "Take the shot," Ghost Viper ordered. Jake pressed the trigger and watched his missile streak toward the enemy aircraft. The explosion, when it came, seemed almost anticlimactic after all the build-up and tension. "Splash one," Thompson called out, indicating that the second enemy aircraft had also been destroyed. The rescue helicopters completed their mission without further interference. The downed pilot was recovered safely and flown to a friendly base for medical evaluation. On the long flight back to Nevada, Jake had time to process what had happened. He had flown his first real combat mission and performed well. More importantly, he had done it under the leadership of a pilot he had initially underestimated based on gender stereotypes. As they approached Nellis for landing, Ghost Viper's voice came over the radio. "Outstanding work today, Ghost Viper flight," she said. "Professional execution under pressure. You should all be proud." Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest. Praise from Ghost Viper meant more than any medal or commendation. After landing and completing the post-mission procedures, Jake found himself walking across the tarmac with Ghost Viper as the sun was setting behind the desert mountains. "So," she said, "still think female pilots get cute call signs?" Jake laughed, feeling the tension of the day finally starting to drain away. "I think I learned that call signs are earned, not assigned based on gender." "And what do you think Ghost Viper means?" she asked. Jake considered the question. After flying with her in combat, he thought he understood the call sign better. "I think it means you're invisible until you strike," he said. "And when you do strike, it's deadly and precise." Ghost Viper nodded. "The ghost part comes from my ability to disappear and reappear unexpectedly. The Viper part." She paused and looked at him with those sharp green eyes. "Let's just say that when I bite, it's usually fatal." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's mission. "Captain Chen," Jake said finally. "Yes, thank you for choosing me for this mission. And thank you for teaching me to be a better pilot." Ghost Viper stopped walking and turned to face him. In the fading desert light, she looked both younger and older than her years. Someone who had seen too much but remained committed to her duty. "You earned your place on this mission, Morrison," she said. "And you earned it not despite your earlier mistakes, but because you learned from them. That's what separates good pilots from dead pilots." As they reached the main building, Jake realized that his whole perspective had changed. 3 weeks ago, he had been making jokes about female pilots and their call signs. Today, he had flown combat under the command of one of the most skilled pilots he had ever met. The experience had taught him something valuable about assumptions, respect, and what it really meant to earn your place in the cockpit. Ghost Viper hadn't just made him a better pilot, she had made him a better person. From that day forward, whenever new pilots joined the squadron, Jake made sure they understood one thing clearly. Never judge a pilot by anything other than their skill and dedication. Because somewhere out there might be another Ghost Viper waiting to teach them the same lesson he had learned. And when that lesson came, Jake wanted to make sure they were ready to learn it with the respect and humility it deserved.